Welcome, Backloggers, to another Backlog Busters Retro Talk, the mid-month show where we dig up the classics and talk about them. And who knows, maybe we'll even learn a thing or two about those golden oldies. But before we get to those perfectly aged retro bits, I'm Patrick, aka the Backlog Odyssey, co-host of the Backlog Busters, and joining me tonight for this episode of episodes, the Chivo Blaster and Xbox Master, straight from the ragiest of streets, Mike, aka Blaze Knight. How are you doing this evening, sir?
Fantastic. Excited to be here as always. How about you? How are you?
I'm doing very well. Very well. I'm excited to talk about the game of the evening, even though I don't have a lot of experience with the series in general. But before we get to it, I have to ask, because I ask everybody, even though this is only, the third episode of the Retro Talks, what does retro mean to you? Because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do believe I answered this question before last time I was here, but I also believe that the answer to this particular question can mold, shape, and change over time. So I think before I said that's anything that was released on a previous generation console, which I think is true, but I think furthermore, especially in application to this particular title, it can also be a style. And I think that's the angle we're coming at today.
Yeah, I can wholeheartedly agree with that. And not only that, I feel like this title is prime because of its storied history and its retro roots. And that's really what intrigues me most about it. But yeah, I like that answer as well, because a lot of retro games have a particular style, have a particular feel, and a lot of modern indie developers in particular try to cash in on that nostalgia and that feeling and that look of retro games. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. And by all means, make the retro style games. If it's fun to play, that's the bottom line, number one most important aspect to the game.
I agree. I absolutely agree with that as well. And with that in mind, I mean, there are many games out there, especially classic franchises, that took the game industry by storm in their prime. But in many cases, out of nowhere, they kind of faded away. Luckily, nostalgia for them keeps those games in the back of our minds, like we just spoke about. A lot of indie developers try to cash in on that nostalgia with the hope that some rogue dev, them in particular, will come to their senses and give us fans what we wanted. Because that's what we're really looking for, is to relive those days of, sitting in front of the TV in the summer, never seeing the light of day, sinking hundreds of hours into Final Fantasy or what have you.
I mean, nostalgia is a very, very powerful thing, and I think most of the entertainment industries know that. That's why there's revivals of so many classic TV shows, reboots of movies, even fashion comes back into play every few years. I remember growing up in the 90s, we had the resurgence of the bell-bottom jeans from the 70s. And, well, I can't say I miss them. And I hope they don't come back soon, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did.
Right, and I remember that as well. Yep. And it seems like the over-the-top colors and patterns are coming back from the 80s in recent days.
I mean, bright and colorful is never a bad thing.
This is true. And I mean, just like fashion, when developers go back and try to reestablish that nostalgia, reestablish that style of game, it doesn't always happen the way that they want it. But in the case of tonight's game, we were fortunate enough to see the revitalization of one of the most storied beaten-up franchises, honestly, Streets of Rage, with Streets of Rage 4, though it may have come from a place you wouldn't quite expect. At least not from Sega, like I would have expected.
Right?
Alrighty, so Streets of Rage 4 released this year, 2020, on all modern platforms. The Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch, even in Windows PCs. which you wouldn't think that a game like this would appear on computers, at least back in, the prime of the Streets of Rage franchise.
Interestingly enough, the game didn't appear where you might have expected it, which is in the arcades.
Oh, yes, that's right. Oh, and that's another interesting point that I discovered when researching this. We can get to it a little bit later, but apparently Streets of Rage 2 was the only game of the franchise that appeared in arcades, which blew my mind.
I didn't realize that was the only one. That is kind of
I
shocking.
know.
That
Yeah,
might help to establish its reputation as one of the most beloved ones, though.
right. Exactly. Exactly. Yep. And what was interesting as well is that Sega didn't head up any of the development for this. It was actually .mu and Lizard Cube, and they took on the development of this game after they finished the remake of the Dragon's Trap. So they do kind of have a good relationship with Sega, since they took the Wonder Boy series, or the Monster Boy series, I guess, and remade Dragon's Trap, which was one of the most beloved Monster Boy games from, I think, the Master System.
See, and I've never played a Monster Boy game, but they look pretty interesting. But that'll be a talk for another day. Anything else
Yes.
about Streets of Rage 4?
So they got the license and started development in 2018. It was co-developed by Guard Crush Games, and they used their modified engine to develop this, which they initially used to create their game Streets of Fury, which I'm assuming was a Streets of Rage inspired game. So enough of kind of the modern thing. So what really ties Streets of Rage 4 to the retro side is, like I was saying, the storied history of the Streets of Rage franchise itself. And it was originally developed by Sega, and it got its start on the Sega Genesis in 1991, and followed up by Streets of Rage 2 in 92, Streets of Rage 3 in 94, and which also appeared on the Sega Genesis. Though, like I was saying, Streets of Rage 2 was the only one that appeared in arcades, and honestly, for the longest time, I thought that Streets of Rage was born in the arcades, not for consoles.
I would have guessed that, honestly. I mean, with
Yeah,
the particular era in question, if there was a beat 'em up, it was probably in an arcade, and the genre is designed in such a fashion that it would be what do we call it? A quarter muncher. A
right,
lot of times they're unfair, um, and they didn't make a lot of changes for the console versions, so you would have expected
right.
that, but lo and behold.
Yeah, yeah, it is cool, and they kind of went backwards with that whole thing. One thing that the Streets of Rage franchise is most famous for is, of course, its beat 'em up action, but also its upbeat musical score by Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima. Which, if you don't know those names, then you should go out and listen to their discography, or whatever you want to call it, because they made some of the most infamous, famous, beloved video game music, specifically for Sega.
Do you happen to know any of those games off the top of your head? Because I honestly have never heard the names, so
Streets of Rage.
I'll
Let me
have to
just
check
see
those
here.
out. I tell you, I'm looking forward to that.
So he did the soundtrack for Space Harrier. He did the Ease series. He did Revenge of Shinobi, ActRaiser, Streets of Rage, of course, Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Adventure Island, Batman Returns, Beyond Aces, a whole bunch of very well known and beloved games for the Sega consoles
It
and
sounds like it.
arcades. And then, of course, Motohiro Kawashima, he came in near the end, I believe, or just contributed to the soundtrack, and eventually became one of the lead composers for many Sega games as well. So there are a ton of playable characters throughout the series, and of course non-playable characters, but they're best known for, or I should say, the characters most well known from the series would be Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding, and Mr. X, the series antagonist, which are the only three that appeared in every entry What's really interesting is that it would take 26 years before we would see a sequel to Streets of Rage 3. And considering how popular the Streets of Rage series was, I'm kind of surprised it took so long.
Well, you know, back in the PlayStation era, they had a chance to continue the series with a game called Fighting Force. It
Hmm.
was
Yes.
pitched to them as a sequel to Streets of Rage 4, or to Streets of Rage 3, I apologize. And it was turned down by Sega because they had their own plans for Streets of Rage. If only we knew it would take
Right.
26 years, they might have changed their mind.
Right. Exactly. And apparently, Sega tried to create a Streets of Rage 4 for the Saturn and the Dreamcast, but they never ever came to fruition. And it took some third party indie developer to come in and say, hey, we'll make it for you before we ever got to see one.
I mean, I think that's the Sega way at this point. After Sonic Mania took off, like, you gotta say, well, maybe let's look at some new talent, see if we can't drum up some business after all. And you know, with those two games in particular, I think they made the right choice.
I agree because, I mean, Sega has some phenomenal franchises, and it just seems like they forgot how to make them good. And it takes some other people to come out and say, hey, we're big fans. We know what we want, so we'll make it for you. And like you were saying, Sonic Mania, perfect example of that. And then, of course, Streets of Rage 4.
I wonder what'll be next.
Right. Well, we got Shenmue, though that was the same developer, wasn't it?
From what I understand, but it was completely separate from Sega. I know that they had to take out all of the Sonic references and stuff from like the capsule machines, which, from what
Right.
I understood, took away from some of the charm of the game overall. Anyways, we're not here to talk about Shenmue. What's up next?
Alrighty, so now that we have some storied history of this wonderful series, let's jump back into Streets of Rage 4. And so this one apparently takes place 10 years after the conclusion of Streets of Rage 3 and the defeat of Mr. X and his crime syndicate. In his wake, a new criminal empire emerges, rumored to be led by Mr. X's children, the Y twins. And Axel and Blaze joined forces along with the newcomers Cherry Hunter and Floyd Iriah. How would you pronounce that?
I think Araya's good. Just say it with confidence and they'll believe you.
With Floyd Iriah. And they all want to thwart the evil empire, aptly named the Y Syndicate, because criminals just aren't that creative. And then, of course, Streets of Rage 4, just like its predecessors, is a beat 'em up, which doesn't surprise anybody, I'm sure. And it has many of the classic mechanics that appeared in the series before it, including items and weapons you can pick up, and a few other new features. So you can recover your health after using what's called a blitz move by following up with a chain of attacks. You can juggle enemies between your co-op partners to extend combos. There's a thing called star moves, which you can use by consuming your star gauge. You can collect star items to recover that gauge. And when you use a star move, it does massive damage to all enemies on screen. So before we, I know we're going to be talking more about your feelings of this game in a little bit, but how did you feel these new features added to the
I
series?
thought they were amazing. Before I dive too much into this, I should say that I played the game co-op with my son local.
Hmm.
So we had two people there, at least for the first playthrough. Most of the times after that was solo, but
Right.
so I got to experience juggling enemies, which was a lot of fun. I really love the blitz move mechanic because it rewards risky play,
Okay.
and makes it so that if you're being unsafe, you get punished. And I think that that's a really good mechanic for the game. And then I really liked the star moves because you could use them to turn the tides of a fight, particularly boss fights. And
Right.
you were rewarded for exploring the environment and even some hidden levels, was finding the stars to increase your star gauge. So I thought they did a really good job with all of the new mechanics.
Yeah, I like the whole idea of you being punished for taking risky moves, but it also you can be rewarded greatly if you can pull it off. I really like that dynamic in games. And like you were saying, the game has up to 4 players locally and 2 players online. And the online features are kind of a huge thing because it's not always easy to get a couch co op partner. And it's really cool to be able to play the game online with your friends. I like the whole idea of you being ranked between missions as well. And you gain these points, which you can use to unlock retro styled characters, as well as 3 other modes like stage select, arcade mode, and battle mode. Now, did you play any of the optional modes?
After we finished our playthrough of the story mode, we tried our hand at battle mode and found out that it wasn't a ton of fun. It was pretty easy to exploit, so we
Mm-hmm.
walked away from that. Arcade mode, when we looked at the way that it is played, we decided that that was too intimidating for our liking, and we walked away from that too. Um, Stage select, I didn't mess around with at all.
Right. I'm assuming that you can revisit stages to find secrets if you miss them during the story mode, but that's the only reason I could see you would want to use it.
Well, you could also go back and work towards getting an A rank on a certain level, or if you're practicing
Okay,
like for a speed run, you could practice certain sections or see
that
which
makes sense.
characters work best for a given boss. So there's a lot of value to having a stage select option for the type of people who would want to further explore the game or master it completely.
Right, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, I mean, one of the coolest things about this game, not only is it a new Streets of Rage, but you get to play pretty much every single character that has appeared, or at least every single playable character that has appeared in the series, including Adam Hunter, who has not been playable since the first game, Max Thunder, not playable since the second game, and then Eddie Hunter, Dr. Gilbert Zan, and so on. Uh,
With one heartbreaking, notable exception that you can't play as Rue. I loved playing as that character in Streets of Rage 3. Was the best part of the whole game. Even though you can't use items as him, it's so
right.
much fun to bounce around as a kangaroo with boxing gloves.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. And you know what? It wouldn't surprise me if the devs came back with like some free DLC or something with additional characters. That would
Uh,
be
I've
pretty
got
cool.
I've got fingers crossed for that one. I saw the in-game character model for Rue just hanging out behind a bar, so everything they need is
Yeah,
there.
we can hope. We can hope. And then of course each character has their own set of attacks, special moves, and so on. So it's not only just skins for the main character. They're all unique in their own way, which makes it, it adds a lot of replayability, a lot of variety, and especially during multiplayer sessions where you don't have to play the same character as your partner, which is always great. Oh, and one of the other coolest things. Now I said one of the coolest things a lot already, but I thought it was impressive that every playable character was animated with 1,000+ frames of animation, and even enemies with 300 to 400 frames of animation. Now that's a lot. That's a lot
Yeah,
for a video game. But you can tell when you're playing the game how smooth those animations are.
I mean, their hard work in the animation and the art style really came through. I mean, the game is gorgeous if you haven't seen it yet. I mean, it's
Right.
in my personal opinion probably one of the best artistic representations of a retro styled game with a modern coat of paint that I've seen in recent memory.
No, and that's super cool. I will admit that I have it downloaded and have not booted it up yet.
Do it.
I want to so bad. I keep looking at it and like, oh, I'll just play it a little later. And then I end up playing something else. But I'm going to have to, especially after our talk, because this is getting me excited for it. All right, so that is enough about the game, enough about its history, enough about all the other BS around it. Let's get to the meat of the potatoes, the interview questions. Alrighty. So you played Streets of Rage 4. You played it with your son. Um, what is your personal history with Streets of Rage 4, and the Streets of Rage series in general?
Well, there's not a ton of history to have with Streets of Rage 4, but I did download it day one from Game Pass and then finished it the weekend that it came out. Um, was a ton of fun uh, playing with my son. As far as the rest of the Streets of Rage series, the only one I played as a kid was Streets of Rage 3. Um, I think I only rented it. I don't think I actually owned it, but I
Hmm.
rented it multiple times because, as we discussed earlier, I could play as Rue, and that was amazing.
I
Um,
mean, you don't need any other reason really.
you don't. Beyond that, I dabbled in the games, especially on my Sonic's Ultimate Genesis collection for the 360.
Right.
Um, I have to agree that Streets of Rage 2 is really good.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know that it can overcome the option to play as Rue for me, but nostalgia. Streets of Rage 1
Right.
is solid, but it definitely pales in comparison to the rest of the series. Um, and then I've played them recently just to get a feel for what they were like.
Right. Right. And would you say, like most series, the first one that you play ends up being your favorite? Or has Streets of Rage 2 kind of crept in and took first place?
Well,
Not including Streets of Rage 4, of course.
why would you take away my favorite, Patrick? That's not fair.
Because that's the
Streets
one
of
in
Rage 4
question.
is
That's the
easily
one we know.
my favorite of the series. Beyond that, I do think I prefer Streets of Rage 3 just for the playable characters. I think
Okay.
the level design and the balance is probably better in Streets of Rage 2, but I like Streets of Rage.
Alrighty. So, what made you want to play Streets of Rage 4?
Well, from the moment I saw the launch trailer, I knew that I really liked the art style. And my son
Hmm.
is going to be an artist, so we're always looking at art styles and animation and things like that. So that
Right.
caught my eye. And then I saw advertisements for it as it progressed, and they announced more characters, and I got excited the more that I saw. And then when I saw that it was going to be day one on Game Pass and that it had multiplayer, which of course it would, um, I knew I had to play it right away. And
Right.
I hadn't played real good beat 'em up in a while, so it just made sense.
Yeah. I mean, you can't deny that the game looks amazing. Myself, I don't have much nostalgia for the Streets of Rage series. Um, Mostly because I was more of a Nintendo guy. I had a Sega Genesis, but
Yeah, I played a lot more Final Fight and Knights of the Round in my younger days than I did Streets of Rage, but
right.
a good beat 'em up's a good beat 'em up.
This is true. This is very true. And speaking of that, Streets of Rage and its sequels, well, maybe not three. I know it's your favorite, but it's probably the least popular of the first, trilogy. Uh,
Look,
they
I've
were,
never been the cool kid, and I'm okay with that. So I can be wrong, but I can still like it.
hey,
That's just the way life
that's
works
right.
sometimes.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. But we know that the series was crazy popular in its heyday. And despite Sega's best attempts, they could never get a fourth game off the ground. Why do you suppose that was? And do you think .mu and Lizard Cube were successful? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, that's a lot of questions all at once.
Oh,
Let's
yeah.
start with why do I think they couldn't get a Streets of Rage sequel off on their own?
Yep.
Well, knowing Sega's very rocky history after the Genesis,
Mm.
I mean, they went through so many consoles so quick that the market couldn't keep up. They had the Sega CD, the 32X, and then into the Saturn, and so on and so forth. And it was back to back to back to back to back. So I'm imagining in my brain that they're going, well, arcades are not doing so great, and beat 'em ups in general are not as exciting, and Streets of Rage 3 didn't do so great.
Mm.
And we keep having to change and update it with our new consoles that we keep. coming out with every couple of years. Let's just hold off on that until they got to the Dreamcast and decided, yeah, we're stepping out of the console market. So
Yeah, I
ultimately,
mean,
to sum up my thoughts, it was a project always on the back burner with a lot of things standing in its way, and it never quite got to completion. That's
yeah,
my guess.
I mean that makes a lot of sense because the developers need time to learn the new consoles and how to develop for them. And if they don't have enough time before the new one comes out, then they just have to scrap what they had or attempt to port it, and that just eats into time and money. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So as far as
And
do I think they were successful? Absolutely. I like I said, Streets of Rage 4, my new favorite. Easily
right,
an amazing game, but it's hard to compare to the previous ones. And I hate that they made it so easy to because they took the characters from the originals and made them playable in Streets of Rage 4. So you can be 1 minute playing your amazing Streets of Rage 4 character with all the bells and whistles, swap to a Streets of Rage 1 character, and suddenly you can't do half the moves that everybody else can, and it's awful.
oh
It really
really?
makes you appreciate what they did. And I just wish that they had given us some more modern characters and a little less of the retro stuff. But
Right.
I understand with it being such a nostalgic game, but that's why they went that way.
Hmm.
Um, it just didn't do it for me as much as more modern characters would have.
That kind of blows my mind that they wouldn't even try to just have those characters in there and then update their movesets to be
I
more in line with the modern ones. But
I mean, you get to play as Retro Max, Retro Shiva, and both of them are bosses in the game. So,
right,
I mean, all the pieces are there. They just had to let you play as them. And it could be that they're locked until after that story mission, for the first time
right,
through.
right.
Kind of like Adam, you have to get to a certain point before you can play as him. I mean, there's ways they could
Okay,
have done it, but I don't know.
right,
Besides
right.
Streets of Rage
Oh,
4, Max is a beast. Look out when you get to that stage.
see, now you're getting me to want to jump in there and figure all this stuff out. So
That's
I'm
the
excited for that.
plan. That's the
Right,
plan.
right. uh, so who was your favorite character to play as when you were playing Streets of Rage 4? And which of
See,
the enemies or bosses were your favorite as well?
I am very biased. As you know, I am Blaze Knight. Therefore,
Right,
my favorite is obviously Blaze. How could you not? Just by name alone.
right.
But in all seriousness, I actually do really enjoy her more balanced moveset. Um, Cherry's fun to play as, being like the quick, fast character, kind of taking the place of Eddie from the earlier ones. I didn't like playing as Floyd so much. The big, slow, strong character doesn't really do it for me. I always struggle with being slow in games.
Right.
Um, but being
Yeah.
balanced is where I like to be, and that's where Blaze is. And her star move is pretty useful because it hits the whole screen, where some of the other ones they don't hit the whole screen; they hit like a section of it. So it made
Okay.
for better crowd control.
Interesting. And I have to ask because I never have. Is your name from or inspired by Streets of Rage? Where's Blaze Knight from?
Um, the 100% true story is it's just something I made up one day. No,
Oh, okay.
no reason. It just is what I got into the community of Mario Maker with, and it stuck. And so
Ah,
that's
okay.
what I've been for my online persona ever since. Prior to that,
Okay.
I'd had a ton of different like screen names because you just change it every time you start up a new game.
Right.
Um, but that's what it is. It's not anything exciting. I
Okay.
wish it was exciting, but it's not. It's just something I made
Hey,
up one day.
this was your opportunity to say yes. I based it off of Blaze from Streets of Rage. So
And
who
I
was your
could have
favorite
said that.
enemy or boss? You could have. You could, and I would have
Um,
believed you.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be true. And I want to be
Yeah, that's
honest
true.
with
That's true.
people.
That's true. I
Um,
appreciate your honesty.
you know, I can't remember all the names of all the enemies.
Right.
Uh, but one of the new types of enemies that they introduced were these guys who come in and they have their hands in their pockets and they never take their
Right.
hands out and they just kick. And they like jump across the screen and kick. So once you figure
Yes,
out that that's how they work, you can slide down or you can slide up and they miss and they're really easy to punish. So I like that
that's
as an
funny.
enemy. And it's easy to work around once you figure it out. And then as far as the bosses that I liked, I don't remember her name. She's the police officer boss. She's another character I would really love to be playable.
Hmm.
Um, she's just really cool. She's got a varied move set. Uh, she's fun to play against. She has grenades, which is an interesting concept. I wish I could remember her name.
The enemies that have their hands in their pockets and they just kick. That feels like something you would find in like that feels like a cliched kind of like delinquent Japanese delinquent kind of character, or their
Oh, and
representation of a punk, where they have their
they
hands in
look
their
the part.
pockets
Let
and
me
they're
tell
just
you.
kind of.
They're
I
slouched
love
back
that. I
some. They
love
got
that.
big baggy pants and no shirts and a
Yes,
beanie
yes,
on, different colors. Yeah,
kind
the
of
whole
like
nine
the.
yards. I mean, that perfectly sums it up.
I love that. And honestly, the only enemies I remember from Streets of Rage, and I could be mixing this up with Double Dragon or something like that, are like the dominatrix girls. But
Ah,
like I said, I
there.
literally the only enemies I can think of.
Well, I'm gonna tell you. Once you fire up the game, you'll probably recognize more than you realize.
Probably so. Probably so. Um, so we mentioned it earlier that you could pick up items and weapons in the game to use them while you're fighting. Uh, so what was your favorite weapon to use, if you can remember what they were?
That's a good question. The way that weapons work in this game is really cool because you can hit with them like normal, or you
Hmm.
can throw them and they'll bounce off the enemies. You can catch them and keep fighting. So it
Oh,
makes for a really interesting battle mechanic.
right,
I think my favorite weapon is gonna have to be the taser that they added with the police officer enemies for
right,
multiple reasons. One, it has a stun effect on the enemies, and even if you throw it, you still get that effect.
right.
But two, they allow you access to the hidden retro stages, which is super cool, and like that's a big reason why they become my favorite.
That is cool. Like the enemies, I don't really remember much of the items. What I do remember is like, can you get a chain or maybe a knife? But those are
There's
pretty standard across all beat 'em ups, really.
knife, pipe, sword. They have a spear. They have like another really long weapon. I think it's a like a paddle, maybe. I don't remember exactly, but uh, the longer weapons are cool too. But as far as
Right.
utility though, using Blaze, if you use a knife, she has like a small combo that she does compared to the other characters, which is kind of neat. So I did like
Okay.
using knives with her as well.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting concept for them to have certain characters use the items differently. I don't know if they did it more than with Blaze, but I like
I
that
think they
idea.
did. I don't remember a specific example, but I feel like Floyd did things differently. Um,
Hmm.
he's a unique character for sure. My
Right.
son loved to
Right.
throw people, and with Floyd, you can pick up one person and then go and pick up another person and then like slam them together and throw them. So like he's so different
Right.
from the other characters. Uh, he had to have used some weapons differently. I just know it.
So Streets of Rage super popular. I've always kind of struggled with beat 'em ups. I don't know what it is about them. It's probably what is holding me back from jumping into Streets of Rage 4, despite it being, or at least seemingly being, so great. So, in your opinion, what makes a good beat 'em up game?
Well, before I answer that question, let me address your first statement there. You
Sure.
you said that fear is what's preventing you from jumping in because they're so tough for you. Which, number one, that blows my mind because you play the hardest games I can think of. But number two, um, remember these games a lot of times were designed with arcade mechanics in mind, and
Right.
arcades are designed
Right.
to take your quarters. So it was design that caused those games to be so much more difficult than they might have been otherwise. But
Right.
rolling back to your question, what makes a good beat 'em up game, in my personal opinion? Um, I think a good beat 'em up game has a few different features. Um, I think the number one most important aspect to a good beat 'em up is enemy variety because it's
Okay.
very easy to get bored if you're fighting the same enemies all the time. Streets of Rage 4 does a great job of having lots of different enemy varieties and mixing it up really well over the course of the game. I think you need character options, which once again, Streets of Rage 4 has in spades,
Right.
to also shake up the gameplay. If you're playing with somebody who's small and fast and it's just not working against this big beefy guy who can't be stunned or whatever, then you switch up your tactic, you switch to the big guy, and you're good to go. So
Hmm.
having options is great. And then I think the biggest key is having the ability to somewhat control the stage. So a lot of times you can like grab somebody and like flip one side or the other and beat them up games. So you can keep people on the same side, or you can throw them one direction so you can keep people kind of corralled where you want them to be strategically, so that
Right.
you're not getting hit from both sides, which I think is important. Or like in the case of Streets of Rage 4, um, you have access to your um, your blitz moves, of which there's three, by the way. You can do
Okay.
your standing blitz move if you just push the button without a direction, and you'll do a defensive one that just like a big attack around you, with not a ton of range, that makes you temporarily invulnerable from attacks and just like pushes everybody back. So that's cool.
Hmm.
If you push forward while doing it, you do like an attack one. So it's a little more aggressive, but it's also directed. And you can be hit during the animation of it. So it's a little more risky, but it's also more damaging. And then third, they have one where you can jump to like extend combos and do a different attack. And I think that the variety of those makes uh, this game in particular really good. Um,
Right.
as far as the mechanics and hoping to keep the game fair. A lot of times
Right.
these games they don't have those mechanics, or like they don't have block. Like this game doesn't have block, but with the mechanics in place, you don't need it. But
Hmm.
like other games, blocking would be helpful, and a lot of them have it. But it's just a good way to help balance the game so that you don't feel like you can't do anything.
Right.
And Streets of
Right.
Rage is all about aggression, so not having a block function is totally on brand for Streets of Rage, I think.
Right. I mean, it has the word rage right in the title. So,
I mean, right there.
and honestly, yeah, there you go. I mean, honestly, I think that's probably what it is with me and beat 'em ups is that it feels like it never feels like you're powerful. I guess it feels like you're always being overwhelmed, and maybe it's that they're unbalanced in such a way that it's difficult to counteract the aggression from the enemies. And not only that, but maybe uh, just the gameplay mechanics themselves. So the fact that you're on this almost orthogonal viewpoint where it's sometimes difficult to line up with other enemies and so on. And that always was frustrating to me. But it sounds like, compared to the classic games, Streets of Rage 4 really thought about ways to mitigate that for players, making it a little more balanced, a little more easier to get into and play and have fun. Um, and I like that.
100%.
Yeah, I like that. Alrighty, so .mu and Lizard Cube obviously made a conscious decision to stick with the classic 2D beat 'em up visuals. Now, was this a good choice, or should they have attempted to try their hand at, say, 3D visuals? And why do you suppose many 3D beat 'em ups have failed in the past? And could that
Okay.
have swayed their opinion?
Okay. So I'm going to need a little bit of clarification on this question. Now, when you say
Sure.
3D visuals, do you mean like 3D character models on a 2D plane, or do you mean a 3D beat 'em up,
Yeah, so
like a
like
3D
3D on
space,
3D.
3D on
3D
3D?
environments, 3D characters. Yeah,
Okay. So did they make the right decision to stick with 2D? Absolutely.
Hmm.
It keeps things clean. It keeps things simple. It keeps things easy to keep track of. Now,
Right,
any game where you play in 3D space, you have to be aware of all of the angles. And that makes tracking the enemies more difficult.
right,
Additionally, you also have to think about like the camera angle that you're looking at, and then you end up with longer draw distances and more things to be concerned about because you're thinking, okay, well, here's this group of enemies I need to take care of, but also here's where I need to go, and here's a thing I can pick up, but like it's way over there, and like it becomes a confusing slog, I guess, in 3D
right,
space, just by the nature of the way we play games on the essentially 2D screen. To create that 3D environment within there is just limiting in general. That's not to say
right,
that there can't be great 3D games. Don't get me wrong. There totally can be. But for this particular genre, I think it doesn't hold up as well. So, like,
right,
going all the way back to the N64 with the Ocarina of Time. In order to make 3D combat work, they had to have a lock on system.
that's true.
Otherwise, you couldn't really fight. Um, if you did something like that in this game, you're going to miss out on a lot of the options that you can have of juggling, of combos, of like defending yourself from multiple directions, and you're going to lose a lot of the that feeling of fairness. I think in the 3D environment.
Right,
So I think
right,
where everything's clean, it's all on one screen, and you can see everything that's going on and everything you need to be aware of in that one little box, I think is amazing for this style of game. And I think that that is the way to go for a beat 'em up.
right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, thinking about it, if they did deviate from the 2D style, would it even be Streets of Rage anymore? Or would it just be some sort of character action game a la Bayonetta or Devil May Cry with a Streets of Rage skin on top of it?
It
And
would
then
be
I
Fighting
bet,
Force, actually. It would be Fighting Force.
yeah, there you go, Fighting Force. That's what they should have brought back.
No, they did
Oh,
the right thing. Streets of Rage 4.
yes, I agree. I 100% agree. Now, to say the original Streets of Rage had fantastic music would be an understatement. Like, uh, it would be a travesty to say such a thing. And despite Yuzo Koshiro and Motohiro Kawashima only making cameo appearances as composers in Streets of Rage 4, which also kind of blew my mind that they didn't have their hands deeper in this pie, but it was nice that they did get some contributions to the game. How do you think the new soundtrack holds up compared to the originals, and which of the tracks are your favorites? Now, you don't have to
Well,
have like specific tracks or anything, but
well, let me tell you, as far as the soundtrack goes, it did exactly what it needed to do for a video game. It
okay,
The soundtrack does, how do I want to phrase this? It sets the tone of the stage, and it sets the stakes, and it lets you know like the level of concern you should have going into
right,
whatever situation it is, and it fits the area.
hmm,
But also, it never envelops the entirety of the game. So you hear it, you enjoy it, but it never overtakes. It's never distracting. So you can still focus on what you need to be doing in the gameplay, and that makes it amazing. Um, with
Right.
that in mind, I can't say a favorite track because it all blended so well that
Okay.
I don't have a standout track. So I apologize.
No, that's okay. Um, I mean, the mere fact that, like you said, it didn't get in the way of the gameplay and the atmosphere of the game means that it was at least composed well, because the music that we remember the most is either the stuff that, is phenomenal. It gets stuck in our brain. We can't get it out of our head and sing along, or the stuff that's horrible and makes us or turns us off completely from whichever scenario we're in. So the fact that they were at least able to create something that benefited the game in such a way is great. Um, Now we have two questions left, and I think these are some of my favorites personally. All right, so why can we never seem to shake the dang shenanigans of Mr. X? And why does Axel and Blaze keep letting it happen? I mean, they're supposed to be the police officers that are protecting this city.
Well, without going too deep into the spoilers for the beat 'em ups, I would say that you consider um, the backstories of these characters as far as why they keep letting it happen. And
Right.
Axel was trying to, in between 3 and 4, just like walk away from things. And Blaze ended up being what's the word I'm looking for? Um, like dishonored by the people that were in law enforcement and pushed out. So
Okay.
she was off doing her own thing and just noticed that things were happening. And she was responsible for getting the gang back together, but uh,
Right.
being out of the loop allowed for, well, I guess the Y twins this time around to come in and make things happen. As far as prior to that, I mean, what is it? Streets of Rage 2, I think Adam gets kidnapped. So they have to deal with that.
Right.
Why they keep letting that type of thing happen, I mean, aside from there wouldn't be a game without it, I don't have an answer.
This is
And
true.
I
Yeah.
mean, as far as shaking Mr. X, apparently they have. Now, the Y
Right.
twins, on the other hand, they could certainly make more appearances. And I would not be sad for it.
Right. What I think it is that, you can't have good without evil. So for job security, they just keep, egging Mr. X on, or the Y twins or whoever, to keep doing these things. Like, they set up the scenarios so that people can get kidnapped, so they have someone to rescue.
I mean, maybe they just really like fighting.
That could be very. I mean, they do live on the streets of rage, so they have something going for it. Alrighty, so final question. If Mr. X was to ever get caught, how many life sentences would he serve?
Well,
And let me tack one extra thing on here because I just thought of it. Is what he did actually so bad to give him a life sentence?
I mean, it depends on how you look at it. I
Right,
mean, he did organize a crime syndicate that caused a ton of mayhem to
right.
the entirety of the city. So, in that regard, I suppose, because there are fights and murders and police assaults going on, and I mean, you figure Eddie and Cherry, they're kids. They're out there beating up
Oh,
kids, and this was
right.
his idea. And if they show up at his place, he beats them up. So, I mean, there you go.
There you
And as
go.
far as the number of life sentences, you can only ever serve one because he only has one life. So
There you go.
that's my answer.
This is true. This is very true. But how do you put a number on that, right?
My guess would be several,
Alrighty,
though,
and
as far as legally is concerned. with all of the
Right,
mayhem
right.
and damage and
Exactly.
that he's directly and indirectly responsible for.
There you go. 1 life sentence for every mayhem he created.
Oh gosh.
Alrighty. And I mean, that is it. Do you have anything else before we sign this whole thing off?
I don't believe I do.
Alrighty. Well, I mean, there's no denying the staying power of a good beat 'em up, despite my fears of jumping in. They usually showcase fantastic graphics. I mean, they're full of fun co-op gameplay and killer tunes, especially when you have Yuzo Koshiro in there, the king of amazing Sega soundtracks. And truly, we couldn't talk about a better entry for the genre than the latest sequel to the storied Streets of Rage franchise with Streets of Rage 4. So thanks so much, Mike, for humoring me and withstanding my hard-hitting questions. So where can the fine listeners find you?
Well, you can usually find me hanging out on Twitter at BlazeKnight0923. And you can hear more from me here on the Backlog Busters.
This is very true. This is very true. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Backlog Odyssey. And if you're in the mood for a cacophony of backloggery, then go out and listen to Mike, Ryan, Serge, Jeremy, and myself each month on the Backlog Busters. Thanks again so much, Mike, for joining me talking about Streets of Rage. It's been a blast.
Always a pleasure to speak with you. And thanks to anyone who listened all the way through. You're the real hero here.
This is true. This is true. We want to thank everybody. And I hope you and everyone else has a great night. Have a good one.